Good evening and happy Friday. I'd like to share with you The Fabulous Dustpan, the story of the Hoover. This book was written in the mid-1950s by Frank G. Hoover, the son of W.H. Boss Hoover. And it talks about the story, the story of the Hoover, from the company's beginnings as tanners and leather goods makers to their beginnings in the suction sweeper business, the evolution of the product through the years, their challenges of managing and growing a multinational company. It's a very interesting read, and fortunately you can get reprints like this one. The preface starts by Frank recalling when he told his father, I think the day will come when we'll be making 100 vacuum cleaners a day. That's what I said as a young man the day we made 25 of them. Boss Hoover said, "Now keep your feet on the ground, Frank." Only a few years later, Frank's older brother said to him, "Frank, you've got to turn out 500 cleaners a day." The production foreman said, "There aren't that many in the world." Shortly after they started making 500 a day, the sales manager says, "I want to sell 60,000 cleaners in 6 weeks. Can production keep up?" Thus did the tail begin to wag the dog. I say that because the Hoover Company did not start out to be in the cleaner business. Cleaners were just a little side issue, the tail on the dog. No, the Hoovers were tanners in Stark County, Ohio. They began in the toll business, as it was called, the toll system, where Daniel Hoover would tan 5 hides, and he would keep 1 hide for himself as payment. That was how things were done, a lot more bartering. Then they figured out if they could make things with their leather tanned hides, they could add value and sell the finished product. One of their finished products was called the Sensible Irish Horse Collar, which was supposed to be a superior, more comfortable design with special rye straw. I like this ad. Though these goods are reasonably priced, the Sensible Irish is not designed to fit a price. It is designed to fit the horse. And they touch on, through this book, the philosophy of not competing on price, but having something special to offer the customer so that price becomes less of a concern. Good advice. I have these pages marked with sticky notes because otherwise we will be here all night. This talks about how, as their business was very horse-centric, they started to become concerned when more and more examples were found of a new technology that let people get about without need of a horse. Internal combustion, they said, horseless. Now, Hoover did some things to keep their leather business intact, like they made leather sporting goods like hunting vests. They even got some big contracts to supply the military during World War I with gunslings and water buckets. In fact, when the automobile was becoming more and more viable and prevalent, they supplied automakers with leather accessories like door stays and magneto covers, and little by little, though, they saw that those were not here to stay. So at this point, a side story begins to materialize about another fella in Stark County, Ohio, smart guy, an inventor named Murray Spangler, who was great at tinkering, not so great at making a living with the things he created. So even after creating a velocipede wagon and a combination hay tedder and rake, He was janitoring at the Falwell building in Canton, Ohio, pushing a king-size version of Mr. Bissell's famous carpet sweeper and breathing dust all night long. He fitted an electric motor to that carpet sweeper to make it easier to push, but then he found that that just stirred up more dust, aggravating his asthma. His co-worker, Emily, said, as he took apart his sweeper right on the department store floor, she said, "And what would you be doing with that brand new pillowcase now?" "I'm hooking it to the sweeper, Emily. You see, I've put the fan blade back on the motor shaft and cut a hole in the dustpan. I figure the dirt will rise from the brush, catch in the air current from the fan, and blow through the hole into this pillowcase." Mr. Spangler had invented himself an electric suction sweeper. Not the very first necessarily, but he had something unique in the very, very dawn of vacuum cleaning itself, and he got a patent. "Shut it off, Murray," his attorney said. "Turn it over so I can look inside." Murray, you've gone nuts." In spite of his attorney's opinion, he did get his patent on June 2nd of 1908. And he made and sold his invention one at a time, little by little. One of the sales he made was to his cousin in New Berlin, Susan Troxel, now Mrs. William H. Hoover. I love this little passage. A clatter of metal in motion filled the Hoover front hall with enough pandemonium to make Jack, the horse, stomp around in his stall. But when the collection of trembling metal had clanked back and forth across the hall rug, the pillowcase was full of house dirt and a lot of the surface of New Berlin's sidewalks. Marvelously, too, the carpet had gone back to its original fine color. When William Hoover and his sons came home from the saddle factory that night, the front hall carpet was not covered with the protective newspapers. They remarked upon this, which was enough inducement for Susan to wheel out the clanking monster. The boys laughed. Herb said, "Mother, you've been taken to the cleaners by the cleaners. Why, this thing will fly apart in your face someday." With graceful firmness, Susan said, "That's all right, boys. You and your father run the factory, I'll run the house." That, by the way, would have been a machine very, very much like that one right there. More on that later. Herb said, "Yes, ma'am, and whenever you want to do the upstairs carpets, just call over. We'll pick out a few good strong men and we'll have it upstairs in no time." In fact, the manuals for these early big Hoovers showed the thing with the handle and bag detached and the maid carrying the body of the machine up the stairs in both arms. So, I mentioned World War I, they had some good contracts. One of them was supplying gunslings for Winchester to put on Russian rifles. Specs called for oak tan telefinish leather, the best. Hoover, your entire lot of 90,000 gunslings has been rejected by the Russian inspectors. This is a cool story, too. Did you put a good protective application of neat's foot oil to these? Absolutely. Was it good and pure? Absolutely, defended the Russian. Very, very pure neat's foot oil. Hoover relaxed. That's the trouble, he said. Notice the instructions call for only 25% neat's foot oil and 75% tallow. Gotcha. There's another little story that I'll share about how they had to figure out a way to admit that the customer was trying to mess with them. A useful skill. At the end of World War I, Hoover's leather contracts for gunslings and water buckets vaporized. So this company was without any business in 1918 at the end of World War I, except for their little suction sweeper that W.H. Hoover had agreed to let Spangler or had agreed to start selling Spangler's invention out of the corner of their leather goods factory. Now, Mrs. Housewife did know that there were electrical suction machines which would clean carpets, but she seldom even saw one, for they were extremely costly, usually were found only in hotels. The fixed plant, as it was called, required a heavy suction pump to be installed in the basement. Metal ducts ran through the walls to the various floors and rooms of the house, terminating in a wall fixture. The maid, these machines were usually found in homes with servants, screwed a length of hose with a suction nozzle into these wall fixtures, and if the suction system was tight enough to be effective, she was able to suck up a layer of dust. The price of this outfit was about $5,000. Back in the day was when $5,000 would buy the average man a whole house. Now, to compete with this, along comes a family of saddle remanufacturers with a little hand-operated machine that cost only $125, which, by the way, in today's money would be about $4,000 for that. And here is their advertisement. This little machine will take up all the dust and dirt from carpets, furniture, and portieres as perfectly as many of the more expensive vacuum cleaners. At a cost of less than 1 cent, you can thoroughly clean any room. Simply attach the wire to an electric light socket, turn on the current, and run it over the carpet. At this point, Hoover had an awesome response to that advertisement. Despite the fact that they were selling to the less than 10% of all homes that actually had electricity. Herb, what's going on? There's 2 sacks full of mail down here for you. You might suppose that Herb Hoover would immediately ship the cleaners to the customer, but this was not his plan. He chose a store in each city. Instead of sending the cleaner to the customer, he shipped it to the store. He mailed a letter to each of the repliers saying that the suction sweeper was on its way via the local dealer. He then wrote a letter to each of the stores he had selected saying that the sweeper was being shipped prepaid to them. Deliver the sweeper to the customer, and after the free trial period, collect the money and keep the commission. Overnight, the little sweeper company had built itself a dealer organization. By the end of 1908, they had manufactured 372 sweepers. This talks about their run-in with the Kenny patent. Remember the installed plant type of suction sweeper? Well, although it was a very different product from Murray Spangler's suction sweeper, it seems these people did have a basic patent on sucking air through a narrow nozzle to remove dirt from a carpet. The Hoovers became party to a lawsuit. The suction sweeper company, in order to get a valid license to this patent, went to Detroit to buy up the vacuum cleaner business of the Palm Vacuum Cleaner Company, which held a Kenny license. This is a cool passage, too. They're not good enough for a nation of housewives who aren't used to mechanical household tools. We've got to get someone in here who's accustomed to engineering around the housewife's inexperience with gadgets. But who can engineer better than Murray Spangler? Murray's too clever with his hands, Herb said. He can take a sick vacuum sweeper and repair it in 60 seconds. He can't imagine why any woman can't do the same. That is a real skill, engineering your product so that people who aren't engineers can understand it and look after it. This talks about the day they moved the wheels back. They figured out that made the vacuum cleaner work a lot better. I'll show you that shortly. Then later in the book, I've skipped ahead quite a bit. They talk about the difficulty after they had so many Hoovers out there and they were all starting to get wear on them. When something happened, let's see here. Okay, so back here. They assembled service kits in trunks that they shipped around the country. Top of the trunk makes a workbench, see? Then in the lid, here are the salesman's tools. Here's his parts department in the trunk. And this trunk will fit right in his house. It's a complete service station workshop, all rigged up in one trunk. There were soon 1,000 salesmen throughout the country doing their own service work. Here's that other story. A lady in Detroit complained raucously that the Hoover had seriously damaged her new and valuable Oriental rug. Herb Hoover took a salesman along with him and personally knocked on her door in Detroit. She was unimpressed by the appearance of the operating head of the company at her door, and she elaborated on the injury to her Oriental. "Yes, Mrs. Miller, that's what I've come about. Might I examine the rug?" She led Hoover to the Oriental rug in the living room. Hoover studied the spot she indicated. It was quite true. The rug did have an odd appearance. There definitely had been damage, but the boundaries of the damage were so well defined and the area so small that it was hard for Hoover to imagine how anyone could even think that it had been done by a cleaner which had covered the entire rug. The area she complained of was in the shape of a right-angled triangle about 18 inches on a side. Hoover studied it silently, not to see if the Hoover had done it, but to decide how in the world you could prove to the lady that the Hoover had not done it. Mrs. Miller, tired of watching him stand there, she left the room to continue her work. Hoover moved some furniture and rolled the rug back, exposing the underside. He kneeled down and examined the rug closely. The rug had obviously been torn. An extremely skillful sewing job had been done from beneath. Mrs. Miller returned to the room just as Hoover was replacing the rug. He slapped the dust from his hands, reached for his hat, and grinned. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "if we admit that the Hoover damaged your rug, will you admit that the Hoover sewed it back up?" This talks about when Hoover started having problems with the motors they were buying, which at that time were from Robbins and Myers. So like that cleaner has a Robbins and Myers motor. He observed some men filing a shaft with a hand file. "Those are the bearing shafts for the armatures. The shafts are out of round. The men are filing off the high spots." Frank Hoover said, "I think we better make our own motors." It turned out they did start making their own motors. Their plant in Canton was soon turning out 2,000 motors a day. When Hoover bought motors outside, they paid $7 and $8 per motor. They made them in-house for $3.50 apiece. They kept working on every part of the cleaner. From the early wheels made of wood, they started to make them out of Bakelite. The early bags made of sateen. By this writing, today they use a special secret process involving a long fibered cotton, and the paper bag has developed to the point where Mrs. Housewife doesn't empty the bag, she just throws it away. The hose on the cleaner attachments and the tank type cleaner was a big problem. The old hose was made of spiraled wire, rubber coated and covered with braided fabric. This fabric frayed as the cleaner was dragged over the floor, and the rubber hose hardened within a year. $200,000 to develop the Very Flex hose, which will not wear out and looks like new after 5 years' use. I've skipped over the part where Hoover set up their Canadian factory in Hamilton, Ontario, and from there began selling cleaners all over Canada and to the United Kingdom, which until 1931 had a slogan that said "Buy Empire." So Canadian goods were acceptable. But in 1931, they changed their slogan to Buy British, which set the wheels in motion for Hoover to build a factory in England, in Perivale, west of London. And this talks about how their factory was made of snowcrete, which is something I've never heard of, which had the unusual quality of being constantly washed off by the rain so that it always looked clean and fresh. This also talks about how the British bankers that made their Hoovers their loan for the factory cautioned Hoover against trying to introduce installment selling in the United Kingdom, as they said, British people will never go for it the way Americans do. Well, shortly after that, Hoover brought installment selling to England anyway, which they called the Hire Purchase Agreement, with tremendous success. This also talks about, at one time there were 17 different kinds of power in the city of London, and the best house in the town had 9 different kinds of power. That was Buckingham Palace, a Hoover customer. As we near the end of this book, I'd like to share this final passage, which to me is inspiring. In 1919, a horse and buggy was going up the North Road to Akron. On the way, it passed a quite battered Model T, which was parked by the side of the road. The woman in the buggy said to the husband who was driving, "You know, Fred, don't you think it's time we got an automobile? There are getting to be an awful lot of them." They rode on in glum silence the rest of the way to Akron. Sometime later, the Model T started up. It passed the buggy, of course, but more important, it passed a 7-passenger Buick with side curtains and isinglass windows and a thermometer in the radiator cap. The lady in the Model T turned her head to look at every detail of this handsome car. The family in the Model T had been laughing and talking. Suddenly the lady said, "Jim, it's time for us to sell this Model T and get one of those larger cars. The Jacksons have one already." The talk and laughter died down inside the Model T as they proceeded into Akron. North of Akron, the Buick passed a Cadillac. It had a rigid-looking top with flower vases inside, and the side lamps had shining crystal lenses that caught the sun. There was a luggage rack on the side. The man in the Buick studied it and said to his wife, "Mildred, this car has enough mileage on it now. I guess we should think about trading it in." The Cadillac continued to the north. Along the lakefront at Cleveland, they were admiring the view, but the daughter saw a glistening white yacht drifting along close offshore. The daughter in the Cadillac said, "Father, the Thompsons and the McDowells have both bought boats." The scenery was no longer very satisfying to the people riding in the Cadillac. Out on the yacht, a family was taking the afternoon sun and enjoying the stiff breeze, but the father looked off his port bow and found himself in the wake of a 36-footer. He said, "Janice, this boat is a little too small for our family. I think we'd best shop around a bit." You can see that no matter how far you carry this story, you never reach satisfaction. Therefore, I say to you, strive for a bigger car and a longer boat if you will, but enjoy the trip while you have a small one. Otherwise, you will wake up to find that you have spent your hour on this earth just chasing the tail of the Joneses' yacht. I'd like to conclude with a quick little look at some examples from not only my collection of Hoovers, but this machine is on loan from a dear friend and fellow vacuum collector, Kyle Critchbaum, who has graciously allowed me to babysit the prize of his collection for a little while. And Kyle, I hope you appreciate some of the little fixes and tweaks I've done to this. It had a temperamental power switch that I've sorted out, as well as rewiring the cord in the original style. with friction tape. But this machine will be from 1909. It's the 75th Hoover suction sweeper. And it has a Westinghouse AC motor. They did also make this in DC because at this time you might have had AC in your home or you might have had DC, and you had to specify which you had when you bought any kind of appliance. This is wooden. Whoops. It's wooden here and here, and of course on the handle. This sateen pillowcase is basically what this dust bag is. The sheet metal is constructed like ductwork, folded and riveted and screwed. Here's that brush roll, wooden, and the wheels are at the ends of the roller. Well, this does have quite a bit of airflow, so it does have the ability to pick the rug up to it. But remember that passage in the book about the day they moved the wheels back? Well, what they're talking about, I'll use this 1914 model as an example. See what 5 years will do? Now the roller is up here and the wheels are back here, and that allows the suction nozzle to pick up the rug in a kind of wave, and the roller taps it back down repeatedly every time it goes around. So from here to here, the cleaning performance of the machine drastically improved. And this model is known as the Old Style Special. It is the 83rd example of this model that Hoover produced. And until the end of World War I, New Berlin, Ohio was the name of the town, but it was renamed North Canton, Ohio in about 1919, and the book does cover that. Here's the first one with the headlight, and the book talks about how they figured out how to run the headlight using the field coils of the motor as a transformer so that the bulb got lower voltage and wouldn't burn out so fast. This is also a good example of the agitator, which Hoover developed in 1926, because they ran into an issue of what happens when those brushes wear down after a couple of years. All of a sudden our fabulous Hoover doesn't clean all that well anymore. They figured out that this not only gave them something new to patent so that nobody else could have it, it also allowed the cleaner to continue cleaning well even after those brushes wore down. And I do like seeing on this, as on my parents' convertible from the 1980s, the Hoover makes rugs last longer. It beats as it sweeps, as it cleans. What's interesting is, if you look at the very earliest example and the very latest example of what's known as a coffee can Hoover, these vacuums look pretty similar. That design stayed pretty constant. And this, I mentioned, is the last coffee can Hoover. This is a model 875. This is a UK machine that was made in their Perivale plant. And it's a companion, a lower priced companion to their model 160. The Henry Dreyfuss designed teardrop shaped beautiful machine introduced in 36. While in this country we had the 150 and the lower end companion was the 25. But In the UK, they had the 875, and it's the only coffee can machine that had a plastic Bakelite motor cover instead of metal. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little look at the fabulous dustpan and this little look at some vintage Hoover examples, the newest of which is just about 90 years old. Thanks for watching, and happy vacuuming.